There are moments in life that don't come with a warning. Moments that arrive in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, dressed up like a normal evening, and then tear everything apart. This is one of those stories. A story about a father, a son, a hospital room somewhere in Texas, and a decision that would force an entire nation to stop and ask itself one impossible question. When the system fails you, when the people who are supposed to save lives start counting down to end one, when every door is closed and every phone goes unanswered, what are you supposed to do? What would you do? Before you answer that, I need you to understand something. The man at the center of this story was not a criminal. He was not dangerous. He was not the kind of man you cross the street to avoid. He was a father, a real one, the kind of father that shows up. And on one January night in 2015, that father walked into a hospital in Tomball, Texas, with a gun in his hand and love in his heart, and he changed the course of his son's life forever. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. His name, for the purpose of this story, is Robert Dale. And if you had met Robert Dale before that January night, you would never in 1,000 years have predicted what he was about to do. Robert was a Texan through and through, broad-shouldered, plain-spoken, the kind of man who fixed things with his hands and didn't ask for much from the world. He ran a small electrical contracting business just outside of Houston, a business he had built from nothing over 30 years. His customers trusted him. His neighbors respected him. And his children, Lord, his children, those were his greatest pride. He had 2 sons. The older one, we'll call him Marcus. The younger one, the baby of the family, the one with the big laugh and the easy smile, we'll call him Danny. Danny was 27 years old in January of 2015. 27 years old with his whole life stretched out in front of him like a highway on a clear Texas morning. Danny had been fighting seizures since he was a teenager. It was the kind of thing the family had long since learned to live around: medication, check-ins, regular hospital visits. Robert knew the routine the way a man knows his own driveway in the dark. He knew what to watch for. He knew his boy. And so when Danny suffered a massive stroke on a cold January morning and was rushed by ambulance to Tomball Regional Medical Center, Robert was there within the hour. He sat in those white plastic chairs in the waiting room the way fathers do, rigid, silent, jaw tight, hands folded too carefully in his lap. And he waited. And then the doctors came out. And what they told him broke something open inside of him that he would spend the rest of his life trying to close. They said Danny was brain dead. They said he was a vegetable. They said there was nothing left to save. They had already called an organ donation organization. Danny's body, they explained, in the calm, clinical tone of people who have delivered this kind of news before, would begin the process of terminal wean, a procedure that would slowly, methodically, withdraw life support and allow his son to die. Robert Dale sat in that hallway and heard every word. And then something inside him simply refused to accept it. Not out of denial, not out of wishful thinking, but because he was a father who knew his child, and everything in his body was screaming that the doctors were wrong. What happened next is the part of this story that no one knew how to process when it first hit the news. Robert went home that evening, turned it over in his mind, turned it over again, and somewhere between desperation and clarity, he made a decision. He was going to go back to that hospital. He was going to get to his son, and he was not going to leave without knowing, truly knowing, whether Danny was gone or whether he was still in there. He had one night. That was all he believed he needed. 3 or 4 hours alone with his boy. He would hold his hand. He would talk to him. He would ask him to squeeze back. And if there was nothing, if the doctors were right, then Robert Dale would let his son go with dignity. But he was not going to let a hospital make that call without him. So he grabbed his gun. Now, before you rush to judgment, I need you to stay with me. Because this story is not about a violent man. This is not about a man who wanted to hurt anyone. Robert himself would later admit, standing in front of cameras with red-rimmed eyes and a voice like gravel, that he had been drinking that evening, that he was not in a clear state of mind, that fear and grief and the desperate love of a father had pushed him past every rational boundary he had ever had. But when he walked into Tomball Regional Medical Center with that gun, he did not walk in looking for a fight. He walked in looking for his son. He walked in looking for 3 hours that the hospital was not willing to give him. The staff called the police immediately. Of course they did. Robert was escorted, or more accurately, confronted, on the way to Danny's room. His other son Marcus was there, and Marcus was able to get the gun away from him almost immediately. But Robert had anticipated this. He told the officers, and you have to understand, this is a detail that would have almost been darkly funny if the situation were not so desperate. He told them he had been in the Boy Scouts, and they should not assume that was his only weapon. It was enough. The police held their position. A standoff began. SWAT was called in. The hospital corridors were sealed. And somewhere behind a drawn curtain in the critical care unit, a father sat beside his son and held his hand in the dark. The standoff lasted 3 hours. 3 hours of police negotiators on the other side of a thin curtain, trying to talk a desperate man down from the edge of his own love. 3 hours of Robert Dale doing the only thing he had ever really known how to do, staying beside the people he loved when everyone else was walking away. And during those 3 hours, something happened that Robert would describe to reporters nearly a year later with the same quiet certainty he would use if you asked him about the weather. Danny squeezed his hand. Not once. Not by accident. 3 or 4 times, on command. Robert would ask, and Danny would answer. The brain-dead boy that the hospital had already notified an organ donor organization about was squeezing his father's hand on command in a darkened room in a Texas hospital while a SWAT team waited outside. Eventually, the police used a robot to pull back the curtain. Robert surrendered peacefully. He was handcuffed, placed under arrest, and charged with 2 counts of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. The hospital released a statement. The news trucks arrived, and Robert Dale was taken to jail, a place he would spend the next 11 months. 11 months while the world debated whether what he had done was heroism or madness, love or crime, a father's instinct or a dangerous man's breakdown. 11 months while his son, the son the doctors had declared brain dead, continued to breathe. Here is where the story changes. Here is where it becomes something else entirely. Because the hospital, facing enormous legal and ethical pressure, having now become the center of a story the whole country was watching, did not carry through the terminal wean. Danny remained on life support. And Danny did not die. Danny recovered. Slowly, painstakingly, the way a man pulled back from the edge of something permanent recovers, with setbacks and hard days and mornings when the progress felt invisible. But he recovered. He woke up. He relearned how to speak and move and be in the world again. And when reporters finally sat down with both of them, father and son, side by side in front of a camera, 11 months after that January night, what Danny said stopped people cold. He said, there was a law broken, but it was broken for all the right reasons. He said, I'm here now because of it. And then he said something that you do not forget when you hear it. He said it was love. Just love. He said it is the duty of a parent to protect their children, and that is all his father did. And then he looked at Robert Dale sitting beside him, and he said, everything good that made me a man is because of that man right there. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Because this is the part of the story that the headlines almost always skip over in their rush to describe the standoff, the gun, the arrest, the SWAT team. They skip over the son who was declared brain dead squeezing his father's hand in the dark. They skip over the father who came home after 11 months in a state jail and found his boy standing upright, alive, walking and talking and running an electrical engineering business beside him. They skip over the question that this story forces every single one of us to answer for ourselves, quietly, in the privacy of our own hearts. What would you have done if the hospital told you your child was gone? If the clock was running? If every person in a white coat was looking at you with the kind of calm certainty that comes from doing this many times before, and your gut, your absolute deepest gut, was screaming that they were wrong? What would you have done? Robert Dale's lawyer, a woman we'll call Patricia Sims, said it plainly to the press when it was all over. She said, this case has always been about a father protecting his son when his son could not protect himself. The hospital, for its part, maintained that its staff acted appropriately and within medical and legal guidelines. And perhaps, by the letter of the law, they did. But the letter of the law and the spirit of love are 2 very different documents. And on that January night in Tomball, Texas, those 2 documents were in the same room, staring at each other across a drawn curtain. And what stood between them was a father who refused to give up. Now, I want to be clear about something important, because this story deserves its full complexity. Robert was drunk that night. He was aggressive. He terrified hospital staff who were simply doing their jobs. The doctors and nurses who responded to that scene did not deserve to be threatened. Medical professionals walk into their work every day carrying decisions that no human being should have to carry, and they do so with training and science and genuine care for the people in their charge. The system that allowed the hospital to proceed with terminal wean over a family member's objection is a legal and ethical conversation that this country was not having loudly enough before Robert Dale forced it into the open. And it is a conversation we still have not finished. The 1999 Texas Advance Directives Act, the law that gave the hospital the legal authority to override a family's wishes, came under enormous scrutiny after this story broke. Advocacy groups, ethicists, and legislators pointed to the Pickering case as evidence that the law needed revision. That a father going to jail for 3 hours of holding his son's hand was not the kind of story a just legal system was supposed to produce. Robert himself never claimed to be a hero. In every interview, every camera appearance, every quiet moment where someone pointed a microphone at him and asked him to explain himself, he offered no grand justification. He said he was a father. He said he knew his boy. He said the hospital was moving too fast. He said he was hopeless and terrified and out of his mind with grief. And in that state, he did the only thing that felt like it might work. And then he accepted the consequences. He did not fight his conviction. He did not try to turn his story into a platform. He went to jail. He served his time. And when he came home, his son was there waiting for him. That, he has said in so many ways without ever quite saying the words, was enough. But here is what I keep coming back to. Here is the question that this story plants in you and does not let go. At what point does a parent's love become a crime? At what point does desperation become assault? At what point does the system, built, we are told, to protect the most vulnerable, become the thing that the most vulnerable need protection from? Danny Pickering was 27 years old. He was an organ donor. The hospital had already made the call. Without a father who refused to walk away, without a man willing to be arrested, to be charged, to spend nearly a year in a state jail, Danny would have died in that room. The organ donation organization would have received the call. The machines would have gone quiet. And Robert Dale would have spent the rest of his life wondering whether, if he had just held on a little longer, his son might have squeezed his hand. There is no clean moral to this story. There is no moment where the music swells and justice arrives on a white horse. What there is, instead, is a father and a son sitting in front of a camera in December of 2015, alive and whole and together, which is the only ending that matters. What there is a community that did not know what to make of what it witnessed, but could not look away. What there is a legal system that put a man in handcuffs for buying his son 3 hours, and then watched that son walk out of the hospital on his own 2 feet. You tell me how to feel about that. You tell me what you would have done. Because I think the honest answer, the one most of us would give if we were stripped down to our most fundamental selves, standing in that hospital corridor with a clock ticking above a door, I think the honest answer is that we would have done exactly what Robert Dale did. We would have walked through that door, and we would have held on. The last thing Danny ever said publicly about that night, the statement that reporters kept returning to, the words that became the emotional signature of the entire story, was simple. He said, "I'm alive and well. My father is home, and we are together again." That is everything. That is the whole story in one sentence. A father went to prison to save his son's life. His son lived. They are together. Everything else, the law, the charges, the standoff, the SWAT team, the curtain, the gun, everything else is just the long road it took to get to that sentence. So I want to ask you something before we close. And I mean this genuinely. I want you to think about it before you scroll to the next thing. If it were your father, if it were your child, if it were your family sitting in those white plastic chairs while doctors spoke in calm, certain voices about terminal weaning and organ donation. If you had one night, just one night, what would you do? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, then there is another story coming that I think is going to shake you even harder than this one. You will not want to miss it. Hit that subscribe button right now so you are there the moment it drops. Because the stories that matter most are the ones they almost did not survive long enough to tell.